Ladies and gentlemen, it's 10:05, so we'll start the Wrocław debate of 2016. Thank you all for coming. This is a very select audience, and I'm told that you've all been personally selected because of your intelligence and your understanding of politics. Thank you for coming. My name is John Martin. I'm Professor of Medicine at University College London and at Yale University in the United States. The idea of the Wrocław debates arose 5 years ago, perhaps 6 years ago, in conversation with President Dukevich of the city, Norman Davies and myself. And we said that Wrocław, and previously Breslau, is at the crossroads of Europe, not only geographically, but of European thinking and culture. Why don't we have a debate every year that will bring together new ideas in a way that's not normally tackled? The Atlantic Council invited us to put this within the Wrocław Forum, and this year we're opening the forum. We're not in the conference center as usual, but there's a new system of having satellite meetings, one of which we are. This year, the debate will be, is there a European political culture? And that fits into Wrocław being the European City of Culture in 2016. Normally, these debates are chaired by Professor Norman Davies. He cannot be with us today, so I will chair the debate. He's had a recent operation, but he's recovering rapidly and will be here next year to chair next year's debate. So I'm joined by 3 colleagues who will be speakers. On my left is Professor Rostowski, who doesn't need much introduction to a Polish audience. He was Minister of Finance, I believe, in the Polish government. On my right is Łukasz Kępara, who is Director of the Office of the European Parliament in Wrocław. And on my immediate right is Christian Davis, who is a commentator and writer who certainly became well known in the United Kingdom for his recent article in The Guardian on Polish politics. I am going to chair, and I'm also going to be a speaker. Christian Davis will go first, followed by Łukasz Kępara, followed by me, and finally Professor Rostowski will bring up the rear and draw things to a close, and he will chair while I am speaking. So I'm going to ask Christian Davis to start.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by quoting 2 contrasting statements, one from Pope Francis and one from Stefan Zweig, the Austrian writer. A few weeks ago in the Vatican, Pope Francis lamented Europe's response to the refugee crisis by saying, "What has happened to you, the Europe of humanism, the champion of human rights, democracy and freedom? What has happened to you, Europe, the home of poets, philosophers, artists, musicians, and men and women of letters? What has happened to you, Europe, the mother of peoples and nations, the mother of great men and women who upheld and even sacrificed their lives for the dignity of their brothers and sisters?" And writing during the Second World War about Europe at the outbreak of the First World War, Zweig observed, "Nation after nation rejected the accusation of being or having been militaristic as a wicked slander. Instead, they vied with each other in declaring that they were cultural nations and making a great display of it. They wanted nothing more badly than recognition of universally valid cultural achievement. All the neutral countries, therefore, were swamped with artistic performances. Germany sent orchestras with world-famous conductors to Switzerland, Holland, and Sweden. Vienna sent its philharmonic. Even poets, writers, and scholars were sent, not to praise military deeds or celebrate the annexation of territory, but simply to show, through their verses and other works, that the Germans were not barbarians and produced not just flamethrowers and deadly poison gas, but works of absolute value to the whole of Europe. Francis was using flattery as a means to criticize. By articulating how we in Europe like to see ourselves, he chastises us for failing to live up to that self-image. And Zweig illustrates how desperately we cling on to this self-image, despite the evidence to the contrary. This was a war, the First World War, that resulted in the death of 9 million combatants and 7 million civilians. And yet, as this was going on, the elites were concerned that their respectability should not be called into question. We are all, as Europeans, guilty of this self-deception, both individually as nations and collectively as a continent. We like to tell ourselves that Europe is defined by its achievements, when in truth our story is just as much one of barbarism, ignorance, and violence as it is about civilization, enlightenment, and high culture. Yes, one can make the case that democracy, freedom, and human rights are somehow inherently European, but there is nothing un-European about authoritarianism. There is nothing un-European about imperialism. There is nothing un-European about fascism. There is nothing un-European about communism. One thing I find very amusing is when officials in the Chinese Communist Party, when saying that they don't want to import foreign liberal democratic values, don't seem to acknowledge that they imported foreign European values when they decided upon a system of Marxism-Leninism, as if Marxism-Leninism is any less European than any other system. There is nothing un-European about genocide, ethnic cleansing, or various other crimes against humanity. What is inherently European is that as a continent we have, and have always had, the capacity both for sublime achievement and for varying degrees of brutish behavior, and that one does not preclude the other. And this is very important. Thirdly, that we are consistently in denial about our capacity for self-destruction. Remember, our continent was named after a woman who decided to clamber onto a big white bull who proceeded to run into the sea and carry her away. Europa was a lunatic and a suicide risk. But instead of confronting these difficult truths about ourselves, we define them away. That which we in the liberal democracies are proud of, we call European. We talk of European values, the European spirit, European or Western civilization. But that which we are ashamed of, we define as the opposite. We call it un-European. Or we qualify it pseudo-European, Eastern European, or best of all, Eurasian. But however we define Europe's political culture, it cannot simply be reduced to the things that we like. This is a terrible mistake, because it may make us feel better, but it leads to complacency. Because it is a denial of something that we should all know by now, that being rich and cultured does not make us immune to our collective suicidal tendencies, and that the greatest threats to Europe have always come not from without, but from within. So let me take quickly the example of my own country, which is Britain, or one of my countries, I should say. It is said by proponents of leaving the European Union in Britain that Britain was successful alone before entering the common market, and it will be successful alone again. But their definition of alone omits one very important word, which is empire. And their definition of success omits three very important letters, which are I, M, and F. British people forget that before we entered the common market, we're not a buccaneering free market paradise, but actually we were a sclerotic, failing country falling behind the rest of the Western European countries. And result not just of the oil crisis in the early 1970s, but because of our own mismanagement of our economy, we ended up having to get, in 1976, a bailout from the International Monetary Fund, which is supposed to be to support third world countries helping to develop. And yet we tell ourselves that if only it wasn't for the other people holding us back, we would be successful again. But we were never successful alone. We were successful with an empire, and it's a very different thing. So if Britain leaves, it will be the result of a great self-delusion that we would be this extraordinarily dynamic economic force if only we could be free of the shackles of Europe. They define Britishness not as we are, as vacillating between openness and insularity, between tolerance and feelings of superiority, between healthy skepticism and despondent cynicism, but as we wish we were. And this lack of honesty about ourselves may well lead to an act of self-harm. The same goes for Europeans as a whole and certain countries in particular. So what is the most inherently European country according to this understanding of Europeanness? For me, the answer is Yugoslavia, not France, not Germany, not Italy. Because in just over 70 years, its people experienced parliamentary democracy, constitutional monarchy, absolutism, fascism, communism, fundamentalism, secularism, imperialism, anti-imperialism, nationalism, and gangsterism, as the state went through conceptualization, formation, expansion, transformation, invasion, consolidation, stagnation, disintegration, and eventual annihilation. It began as an elite project, the unification of the South Slavs, and it no longer exists. And there's nothing more European than a country that doesn't exist, as Poles will know. But what did the rest of us care about this country and the people who lived in it? You still hear people saying Europe has been at peace since the Second World War, even after a European war that killed 100,000 fellow Europeans. The Balkans are dismissed as a special case, different, or even as crazy, but they are more European than all of us, because they experience what it means to be European more intensely than all of us, or nearly all of us, I should say. And the lesson of Yugoslavia is this: there is no one European political culture. There are many European political cultures. And I don't mean national political cultures. I mean ideological political cultures. Good, bad, and indifferent. And every generation must fight to maintain all that is good about the continent, rather than pretending that what is bad is simply alien to us, because it is not. And one final point. In a park in Sarajevo, there is a giant tin of canned beef with a European flag on it, with the words, "Monument to the international community by the grateful citizens of Sarajevo." 10,000 people died in the siege of Sarajevo, and as many went hungry, the international community, fellow Europeans, were sending them tins of meat that in many cases were 20 years old. In many cases were pork, despite the city's Muslim population. And with that monument, with their sarcastic thanks, the people of Sarajevo are reminding us of something we don't remind ourselves enough, that however ambitiously and comfortingly we wish to define a European political culture, we rarely live up to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Christian, I disagree with much of what you've said, but I won't do that as chairman, but when I'm speaking. One of the main purposes of this debate is your interaction. We're going to speak for about an hour, and then there will be questions to all of us that we want to be as challenging as possible. We have an interpreter here, thank you very much for being here, who will interpret questions from Polish into English for us to understand if that's necessary. Okay, so the next speaker is Łukasz Kempara.
Thank you very much, Professor Martin. Thank you very much, Christian, for your contribution. I must say that I was impressed by the negative message you delivered. I was not prepared for such a strong negative message. You are even more negative than a gentleman who approached me about 2 days ago to say that we have did something wrong with the title of our debate today, because we are mixing two words in one sentence that do normally not work together, which is politics and culture. Of course, I do not agree with such a strong negative message. The opinion of the gentleman was unjustified and perhaps too critical, exaggerated. And I will try to prove today that European political culture is not something that exists only in dictionaries, but it is something that we can touch on everyday basis, something that exists. And it does exist not because it came out of nothing. It exists because we made it. And we made it step by step. We made it year after year. We made it crisis after crisis, compromise after compromise, and treaty after treaty. Perhaps this is more visible from the inside of the European Parliament. The only directly elected legislative assembly of that kind, representing more than 500 million citizens from all over the Europe, from 28 different countries, which the power of adopting laws which are binding in all the member states, working in 23 official languages. Do we need a better example of how this European political culture manifests? Do we have a better example of how does European political culture manifests? This culture takes very concrete form. As I see it, it has the form of the treaties, of the institutions, of common policies, of the procedures, and of course of values. Common European values. Those values have been, for more than a half century, a guiding light, a lantern, a lighthouse for many candidate states who had to reform very often completely their political systems from various totalitarian systems or even dictatorships. And they had to restructure not only the political system, but they also had to restructure fully their economies, their administrations, and they managed, and here I would like to give the proud example of Poland and the whole of the Central and Eastern Europe. We did it. It was a successful project. And I know, of course, that European Union is not the only European institution. It is not even the biggest European or political organization, but definitely it is the most important one. I know that what is European and what is not European will be seen completely differently from Washington than from Berlin or London or Moscow, but for the purpose of today's debate, I would like to adopt this EU-centric approach and the perspective of Brussels and Strasbourg. And it might be a little bit abusive in the geographical sense, but it will be not, hopefully, in a political sense. I would like to adopt such an approach, especially because now Europe, the European Union, and its achievements are being very often underestimated. And this is a pity. And this is a pity because, as I said before, what we have achieved in Europe is mainly due to the activities of the European Union. As I said, we have been the Parliament, the Commission, the institutions of the European Union have been this guiding light for many countries, which ended up in this successful integration into the project that brought peace and stability and also economic development for so many member states so far. But now Europe is losing part of this attracting power. The Union is facing probably the biggest crisis ever. I know that European Union's history is a history of crises, and normally so far the Union managed to overcome the crises and become even more stronger and even more integrated and even more with more solidarity within the member states. But now it is not given for certain that it's going to end up in exactly the same way. This crisis is much more persistent. It all started we can say many years ago already, with the so-called financial crisis, which then developed into an economic crisis, which then developed into the political crisis. And in addition to this, we have a humanitarian crisis related to the over 1 million refugees and migrants coming and crossing the borders of the European Union that we will have still to solve. What I would like to say, that Europe is not responsible for this situation. European Union didn't have any tools and instruments to create such a problem or to prevent such a situation. Unfortunately, the Union doesn't have instruments to put an end to such a problem, at least in a very imminent perspective, in a short term. But still, that kind of sentiments serves very well all kinds of revisionism, nationalism, xenophobic sentiments toward the Union. And those sentiments will be growing, will become stronger, or will become louder at least. And at the same time, Union's popularity will be diminishing. Already now, there are no countries who hurry up to join the Eurozone and adopt the common currency. There are countries who are thinking seriously about closing the internal borders of the Union despite the Schengen Agreement. There are countries who consider seriously leaving the European Union, and we are going to have this British referendum in 3 weeks' time. There are countries who question the power of the EU institution and who question the procedures adopted by those institutions. Don't ask me for the examples, but we don't need to look far. And the very sad message, the very sad conclusion about this is that independently of the British referendum outcome, it may happen that some countries will like to play the same exit card, to adopt the same or similar strategy, because they have seen that in case of Britain, it was useful because Britain was able to negotiate very concrete, let's say, bonuses for them in terms of the functioning of financial markets, the welfare policy, and role of the national parliaments. So it may happen again. And Europe is definitely standing at the crossroad. Some countries may go to the left, which is very unlikely. Some countries may go to the right, which is more likely. Some countries may decide to make the U-turn. We can call it an EU turn, and we'll go several steps back. But still, there will be countries who will continue on the path of further integration, giving in such a way life to the so-called union of two speeds. And this is a scenario very dangerous and probably not positive, especially from the point of view of Poland and Central and Eastern Europe. So, in a conclusion, I would like to repeat that we have this political European common culture just because we made it. It was a hard process. It took a long time. And if we would like to preserve it, we'll all have to engage. And this is the moment. Thank you very much.
Łukasz, thank you very much indeed. I agree with much of nearly all of your sentiment. I can see we've got a polarity occurring already in the panel. So since I'm going to speak next, I'm going to ask Professor Rostowski to chair.
Thank you very much, John. It's a pleasure to be able to take your place, even if only for a few seconds. Please, go ahead.
So the question is there a European political culture? And I'm going to try and analyze, is there a European culture? Is there a European politics? And therefore, is there a European political culture? I looked for a definition on Wikipedia of political culture. I couldn't find one. So I've defined it last night as the manner of achieving laws that apply a culture. How about that, Christian? Simon Bolivar is the hero of South America. And there's a wonderful book by Garcia Marquez called, in Spanish, El General en su laberinto, the general in his labyrinth, that describes the last few months of Simon Bolivar's life. Bolivar had a great idea. And one of my themes is going to be idea is more important than the abuse of the idea, Christian. And I agree with my colleague on the right. The idea of Europe is more important than anything else. Bolivar wanted South America to be one country speaking one language, Spanish. And the constitution he chose for that new country was the Constitution of the United States, because that was based upon a British constitution, which was based upon European ideals. Bolivar failed because the whole idea collapsed because of fighting between small groups of people geographically dispersed, and those groups were self-interested, not interested in the idea. And I think, Chairman, that is what's happening in Europe at the moment. For me, European culture is the Sermon on the Mount, one of the most wonderful statements ever made about humanity, made by Christ. Thomas Aquinas, refining that philosophically. The Enlightenment, where we got rid of theology, applied that to science, then to Karl Marx, and then to a balance of all that in our century. And I think the essence of European culture is that the strong should care for the weak, combined with valuing the individual. And this is made concrete in certain cultural-social aspects of the way we live in Europe uniquely. Socialized healthcare, education for all, individual freedom but regulated, press freedom but regulated, and no death penalty in any European country. And you should ask yourselves, why is it that only Europe totally denies the death penalty when it is found in many other countries across the world, including the United States? So these principles, these ideals, which we all share in Europe, I as an Englishman, you as Poles, are put into action via politics, using debate to achieve majority consensus through elected representatives. That's the practical manifestation of putting the idea into action, combined with the acceptance of the will of the majority, and all this funded by regulated capitalism. So I've used the word regulated, I've just realized, several times, Chairman. And perhaps one of the essence of the way we do things is the amount of regulation we apply to freedom and how we decide on that regulation. Okay, is there a culture of that politics that is European? We have an English author called Trollope. I presume most of you haven't met him, but he wrote many, many novels at the end of the 19th century, mostly about British politics. And there the politicians in Parliament were all amateurs. They had a job in the day, and in the evening they went to Parliament and they decided how to enact laws. There were political parties, but the members of those parties shifted depending upon the subject. For example, there was a problem of that time of the nationalism of Irish and Irish Catholicism versus English Protestantism. And there was great concern to solve that problem with truth and justice, so that members of one party would go to the other party if they thought that truth was not being attained, and then back to their own party. This is something that we are missing in our modern European culture. It is diminished. the political application of the European cultural idea is diminished. One, because of our political parties have no longer been organizations to achieve truth and justice for the people, but contain people who have a career in that party, and the only objective of those people is their own self-betterment through the party, nothing else. Truth is not a concern. Focus groups are used to decide what the people might vote for or not, leading to a lack of leadership among politicians to an ideal. And the politicians are now desiring their own self-aggrandizement through deciding what the people will vote for, not what they should put before the people as an ideal. There is pragmatic self-interest. One of the worst examples of this in European history over the last 20 years is the relationship between Tony Blair and Murdoch, who owned a large number of newspapers. There was a deal done between Blair and Murdoch that if the newspaper controlled by Murdoch supported Blair in his election, then Blair would not take Britain into the euro. What a dirty deal. That determined that Britain did not join the euro. If Britain had joined the euro, as Blair wanted, perhaps there would have been no euro crisis. Perhaps the added economic power of Britain coming in with Germany and France and Italy, plus the discipline of the British as opposed to the French and the Italians, might have made a completely different history of Europe. I believe all our present problems might have turned on that one decision by a self-interested person in a political party. We are 3 weeks away from a referendum in Britain about whether Britain should leave the United Kingdom or not. The standard of debate is incredibly disappointing. Nobody talks about the European ideal. Everybody talks about nostalgia from empire or economics. So I believe that a European political culture does exist, and it was at its best at the beginning of the European Union when countries gave up sovereignty. It's found in the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and in India, where it is spread, and to some extent in South America.